Today we read a portion of the story of Ruth and Naomi from the book of Ruth. Last week, the lectionary had us listen to the beginning of the story in which Ruth and Naomi and Ruth's sister, Orpah, are together at a crossroads, trying to decide where to go. Naomi dismisses her daughters-in-law and says, "Go home, go to your land, go to your kindred in the land of Moab, and I will return to my people." See, there's been a famine in the land, and they are returning home. Naomi's husband has died, and the sons have died, and she says, "I have nothing left for you. So go home to your kindred." And Orpah does. But Ruth decides to stay with Naomi. And in that beautiful passage, which she says, "Where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Today's story picks up sometime later, and things are a little bit better for Ruth and Naomi. We find Naomi hatching a plan to give them some security. Ruth has been working in the fields, gleaning the crops in Boaz's fields, and Naomi would like to kind of set up Ruth and Boaz to see if they could become a couple, maybe get married, maybe provide a little more security for her daughter-in-law. But more on that later. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. How many times had Naomi heard Ruth's words echoing in her mind since that day? Even after all this time, the scene was still etched in her memory, engraved on her heart, with a love so deep it probably hurt sometimes. Naomi's husband had died, and her son had died, and it was time for her to go home to Bethlehem. The famine was over, and as much as she dreaded the thought of being on her own, alone in her bitterness and her grief, she had decided to let her daughter-in-laws go. They needed security. Security that Naomi could not provide. She wanted that for them. If she couldn't, she could at least give them a release. Free them to go home, to go back to Moab, to their village, and to what they knew and what was familiar. Surely there must have been people in Moab who would take care of them. She didn't know the customs of Moab, whether they had extended family there or cousins, men who could marry Orpah and Ruth and provide for them. She didn't know if they had those things, but she sure hoped that it did. And it was in their best interest to do so. So she asked them, and then she begged them, and then she drew up her tired body to its full height, and she ordered them with all the authority as a mother-in-law could muster. And that's a lot of authority. And she told them, "Go home." And one daughter-in-law, Orpah, says goodbye and returns home. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, says, "I am home." Why did she do it? Naomi often wondered that. Why did Ruth cling to her? Did she feel sorry for Naomi, who was now old, didn't have much of a chance of marrying again? Was Ruth foolish enough to think that she could somehow take care of her in Bethlehem? Ruth was a native of Moab. She was a stranger in this land of Judah. Why would Ruth forfeit her chance for security for the sake of someone else? Naomi often shook her head at the memory of the two of them on that dusty road so long ago. A bitter old woman and a naive young foreigner. they made quite a pair as they made their slow and halting journey toward Bethlehem. Ruth, for her part, didn't think much about that day, about her decision. It was just too much to do so. Reflection was a luxury she could not afford. Gleaning crops was what she did. Hard work from dawn till dusk. The reapers would go before and pick the crops, and then she would go behind and get what was left. The reapers had even been told by Boaz to watch out for her, but still, under that punishing sun, the brown fields of grain would flutter before her eyes, and she would again think of that parched road that leads to Moab. But she always dismissed that memory in a hurry, like brushing a gnat away from her face. What's done is done, she would tell herself as she filled her baskets with the remnants of corn and barley and security. Security. That's what Naomi wanted for Ruth. She went on and on about it. But what does security even mean? What difference did security make? Ruth used to have security. And what good had it done her? She married a good man from a good family. She'd been a good spouse. She'd been a good daughter-in-law to Naomi. And when the famine came, they even did what was sensible. They packed up their things and they moved to Moab, built a new life there, a secure life. But still, her husband died. They had run from misfortune, but misfortune had pursued them, found them, overtaken them. So when Naomi told her to go back, Ruth knew it was the right and sensible thing to do. But what was the point of doing the sensible thing, the secure thing? Standing that day on the road, halfway between nowhere and nowhere, Ruth decided, forget the sensible thing. I'm going to do the right thing. And in her case, the right thing meant salvaging leftover crops for herself and for her mother-in-law, Naomi. It meant that she, a stranger in a strange land, would take care of a woman to whom she had no legal obligation. Didn't make a lot of sense. It certainly wasn't glamorous. She didn't feel noble. Her hands were rough with the calluses, her eyes stinging from the sweat of hard work. Or were they tears? It was sometimes hard to tell. But love is like that. Lately, Naomi had been talking about security again, but this time she's got a plan for Ruth. A proposal. Actually, if everything went well, it'd be a proposal from Boaz. Proposal of marriage for Ruth. Naomi says, I need to seek you some security so that things may be well with you. Ruth wants to say, things are well with me. The famine is over. They're managing just fine. This is what she agreed to do when she said, where you go, I will go. Yet Ruth knows that part of love is receiving what others have to give. Others look at Naomi, see the sun setting on an old woman's life, her body casting a long shadow of grief against the sky of faded colors. But Ruth sees it differently. Even after Naomi's lifetime of sadness, while others have married, had children, had prosperity, While others had filled their storehouses with every blessing under the sun, Ruth had been gleaning the crops, walking behind the others, harvesting a little bit of this, a little of that, and enough to share with her mother-in-law, Naomi. But Naomi was doing some gleaning too. Different kind of gleaning. She had something for Ruth. I can offer you a little hope, a little wisdom. There's a handful of risk and a little bit of daring, but that's all I have. And so Ruth follows Naomi's instructions. She goes to Boaz, and he welcomes her. He blesses her. And in the fullness of time, they are married, and a child is born. The child is a gift for the future, but he's also a gift to his forebearers, to Naomi, because it is she who becomes the baby's nurse, who takes care of him. Her life has purpose now. Her journey is far from over. It's only beginning. As she holds that new life, she vows to nurture the next generation. It's not her child, and yet she's responsible for that child. Your people will be my people, said Ruth so long ago. And now Naomi, holding that baby, understands that promise because she realizes it is so much more than just a promise. It's a lifelong responsibility for both of them. Naomi remembers once again that day when Ruth said those life-changing words, and she wondered, whatever happened to that other daughter-in-law? Whatever happened to Orpah? Naomi had sent her home to be safe. Naomi had sent her home to be secure. And for all we know, she went back to her family as she had been told to, and in time, she married again as she'd been expected to. For all we know, she was a perfectly good person, living her life quietly, safe in the security of home, and safe also in obscurity, because we never heard from Orpah again. Her story was never told. But as for Ruth, now she had Naomi and Boaz and a child. Was this what security looked like? A child? Or was it really hope that she'd been longing for? Hope that they'd been seeking instead of security. Hope and a sign that this was not the end of the story. They could not know when holding this baby that their story would be told. They could not know that this child would be the father to a man after God's own heart, a man named David, who would become a king. They could not know that 14 generations after David, their descendants would be thrust into exile, forced to find their way back to God, and that they would find strength in their ancestors. And they would find strength in the memory of that woman from Moab. And they could not know that 14 generations after that, another son would be born. This one in a stable. A man who embodies all that came before and so much more of what would come after. Who also stays away from the sensible thing. Watch me do the right thing. Then you go and do likewise. A man who does not provide security, but gives purpose. Purpose with a bold and outrageous hope. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.